You can check it out at theathletic.com. He's always good to provide you insights and information both in the pre-draft and the post-draft. Bruce, thanks for taking the time. We appreciate it this morning.
Good morning, guys. Thanks for having me.
So I guess throughout your coverage, not just the reporting after the fact, and I'm sure you're keeping tabs on things and talking to people throughout the course of the live stream coverage that The Athletic did have, Bruce, but I guess after the fact, when you really dug into the Shaduer Sanders thing, how much information were you able to glean about just how far this kid fell?
Yeah, I would categorize it as really he plummeted. Because I think it's one thing if he went in this late second or third round, people could say, okay, well, there weren't that many teams who had needs, and his stock was not as high as draft Twitter or the draft analysts thought it was. Going into the draft a couple of weeks ago, last week, I had talked to coaches, NFL coaches, coordinators, quarterback coaches, who felt like he was more developmental and they just did not see any elite traits in him. They liked him. They just didn't think they thought there was a big gap between him and Cam Ward. And I, wholeheartedly buy that. Now, as he started to fall, it's funny, on Saturday morning, I got a text from an NFL receiver coach. It wasn't like I'd asked him, and he just said he's got a skill set, but no dominant trait, and he's a backup at this point, and those guys have to be wired for humble support of the starter. And I think that the point that came back to me a couple of times over from people in the NFL was the chemistry of a quarterback room is really important, especially as it relates to the starter and who he wants to be in there and who he's comfortable with. And I heard, before I came on, I heard you guys mention, he didn't go to the Senior Bowl. He didn't work out at the NFL Combine. There was just a lot of stuff where I think it didn't sit right with people how he was handling the process. And so I had reached out to another NFL quarterback coach yesterday, and he just said the intel I got was shocking. This guy has, quote, no awareness about how he's coming across or the type of leverage he has or doesn't have. And I thought that made a lot of sense with some of the other things that I'd heard, which again, doesn't mean he can't, develop into a starting NFL quarterback. The Browns is not a bad situation for him to be in because, you have Joe Flacco, who's 40 years old. You have Kenny Pickett, who struggled when he's had the chance to be an NFL starting quarterback. They took Dylan Gabriel, 2 rounds earlier. I think Dylan Gabriel is a guy who will probably be on a roster somewhere because, character-wise, people like him. He's got a quick release. He's pretty athletic, but he's a small quarterback. Shaduer is a different style quarterback, but he's going to get a chance. But, he also could get cut if he doesn't seem like a good fit in Cleveland. There's really not a lot of risk in taking him there at like 144.
Bruce Feldman of The Athletic here with us on 104.5 The Zone. You can check out his 2025 NFL Draft takeaways, the intel that he was able to gather, not just on what was the largest story of draft weekend, but everything else that was very thoroughly documented in the piece. Theathletic.com for more information is always well worth your subscription.
Obviously, Bruce, Cam Ward's NFL draft was the complete inverse of Shaduer Sanders and what we thought was going to be sort of this race to the finish of who's going to be the number one pick, at least at the beginning of the draft process before Cam really separated. But for you, whether it's talking to college coaches that were around him, coached for him or against him, or NFL coaches and execs, what's the most interesting piece of feedback that you received about the Titans' number one overall pick?
I think there's a bunch of people in the NFL now who came away from evaluating him over this whole process and studying his development who think if he was in last year's draft, I'm not talking about the version of Cam Ward coming out of Washington State. I'm talking about this version. He is as good as a lot of the guys who went, those 6 quarterbacks who went in the top 12. Would he have gone first? Probably not. But I think he would be somewhere in the middle of that cluster. Michael Penix Jr. has a big time arm. There's a lot of juice in his arm. That's why he went 8th. J.J. McCarthy, I think there's people who it depends on who's picking at that particular spot. But the coaches I talk to, I think they're more intrigued by Cam Ward's overall arm talent and playmaking ability than J.J. McCarthy. Bo Nix it looks like a terrific fit for what Sean Payton's doing. But I think this guy has a legit chance to be a top 10 quarterback in the NFL. He has got one of the best arms who's in the NFL now when he comes in, because his ability to drop down and sling it like a middle infielder and make quick decisions, RPO game. He's just got like a fearlessness to him about him. Now, the part that it does give them a little concern is he has been reckless with the football at times throughout his career. He didn't throw a ton of picks last year, but the coaches I talked to were like, you watch the film, there's a bunch of balls he threw that should have been picked off, that they kind of, they mark those too. It may not show up in the stats, but it shows up on their film. So I think also, I know the Miami staff really well. Shannon Dawson, the offensive coordinator, did a really good job with him. He told me from the moment that Cam got there, they were blown away by his competitiveness and his leadership skills. I mean, it jumped out at them. I'm talking about like from the time he got there. This wasn't just something I heard like in the draft process. This is from the time he got there. And I think Miami was struggling as a program. And I'm not saying that they're ready to win a national title, but he was the biggest difference and made them a playoff contender from being like a 500 team that was losing bowl games to bad teams. They were still bad on defense last year, but he made them really good and he made them relevant again.
Bruce, there's so many different, pitfalls with the current state of collegiate athletics with transfers and NIL and things like that are covered at great length. I don't have to tell you that, of course, but the transfer situation for quarterbacks in particular, it almost feels like it can help either develop those kind of qualities or weed out the kind of players going to the next level who do not have that, because it is so difficult to capture that many people's attention to lead, especially when you're dropping in from the sky. And Cam Ward was a known commodity. It's not like this guy was a complete unknown coming into Miami, but for all the different stories that we've heard, and we've heard them at great length, obviously, we've had tons of time to talk about Cam Ward here in Tennessee. It just seems that has helped bring out the traits that he may already have had and make him ready for an opportunity like this that is really difficult, especially when you're dealing with guys in their 30s who have made second contract type of money, who have families and are going to be led now by a rookie quarterback coming in.
Yeah, I think it's a tricky dynamic because you have agents and sometimes they're honestly, they're not agents like you typically see in the NFL where they have been certified. Some of them are just kind of winging it. And so you're maybe not getting the best advice throughout the process. What I think helped Cam Ward out a lot was he went from being a no-star high school recruit who played in a wing T to being a prolific quarterback in the FCS level, and then a quarterback at Washington State, where he kind of try to keep a program afloat that was getting left behind by its own conference in the Pac-12. And then he looked at going in the NFL last year at this time, and he would have been probably a 5th round pick. And he bet on himself, went to Miami. They went all in on him. And I think you saw him keep growing and keep developing. And I think those are the parts that worked out great for him. For other guys, it can, they get money when they haven't had money before. They can feel like they quote unquote made it. And so you can get a sense of entitlement and a false sense of I don't want to say what you're worth, but a false sense of like where you are. And you can kind of lose yourself in that. I mean, it's different because I'm not saying, we'd be naive to think a lot of college athletes didn't have money before. Before NIL, people were, not everybody, not a lot of people, but some players were getting paid under the table. They had some money, but this is different. Now, all of a sudden, people think they know exactly how much you're making, and it can mess up the locker room. And it presented all sorts of challenges. I think in Ward's case, it seemed like he was mature enough and wired right to be able to handle all that.
Bruce Feldman of The Athletic here with us on 104.5 The Zone. Check out his latest piece on the intel that he was able to gather during and, of course, in the aftermath of the 2025 NFL draft. I always like seeing where the guys on your freaks list go, Bruce, and the Titans were able to land one of them. In fact, that's the only reason I can't pretend that I was watching a ton of Sacramento State offensive line play. But Jackson Slater, who you had 38th on your freaks list this year, ends up coming to Tennessee on day 3. What did you like about the player, and what do you think about him translating at the next level, where Titans' offensive line situation has been one of the biggest issues that has caused the fallout from when they were hugely competitive from 2018 to 2021, we'll say, and everything specifically has devolved because of how poor their offensive line play has been.
Yeah, I like him. He's really powerful. He's a pretty explosive athlete for an interior guard, interior lineman. I think he's a really good value for them to get him in the 5th round. I could see him playing, being a solid starter down the road, and I think he'll be a good, a good piece in the offensive line room for the next couple of years as he develops. Obviously, there's going to be a learning curve because he's going to be playing against way better talent, and I think that jump is significant to go from FCS, especially. It wasn't like, sometimes you'll see like Gray Zabel from, North Dakota State. You see some of these guys from the Missouri Valley Conference where they're, I feel like, playing a little better competition than some other FCS football is, but it's still a steep learning curve for those guys. It's even steeper when you're coming from Sac State. But look, I think to get him in the 5th round, it wasn't a surprise to me that that's where he went, because he's pretty athletic, and like I said, he's really strong. I don't think he's gonna look out of his element there in the NFL.
And he's got time behind Kevin Zeitler, who's on a 1-year deal here. Bruce Feldman here with us on 104.5 The Zone.
Bruce, you wrote in your draft takeaways that it felt like Al Davis was running the Raiders draft room with the selection of Tennessee receiver Dante Thornton in the 4th round. Obviously, speedster, the 4.3 40, flashed throughout the pre-draft process. Just what did you make of that landing spot? And, you having kind of one foot in the NFL, one foot in college football, and the way that you cover things, how important do you think it is for Tennessee's program, for someone like Dante Thornton to find a foothold and find some success at that position in the NFL?
Yeah, I think the more quarterbacks and receivers can flourish in the NFL, that's better it's going to be. I'll be honest, you can kind of lump now Ole Miss into that, because, talking to NFL coaches when they're watching Ole Miss, now they're like, this isn't the Lane Kiffin of USC days. This is that version of the Baylor offense, and it's a version of what Tennessee's doing. It's not the same, but there's a lot of, it's a different translation, I think, of the same thing. And what I think will be important is, can one of the quarterbacks from this system end up, it's either Hendon Hooker right now in the pipeline or Jackson Dart, where they can really break out and show they can stick and be a legit NFL starting quarterback. But when it comes to Thornton, I mean, the NFL receivers coaches I talked to were very intrigued by him, because there's a couple of things he can do right now. He can take the top of a defense off at 6'4", and he's got good size and blazing speed. His hands are inconsistent, and his route tree is limited. Right now, the stuff he did at Tennessee, that's enough for people to go, we'll give him a chance and seeing if he can really develop. But at least at least there's some elite traits there. He's got 2 of them. He's got good size and he's got great speed. And we've seen plenty of guys. The comparison I had for him was Marquez Valdez-Scantling, who was in Green Bay for a while, and then the Chiefs. Inconsistent hands, but if Thornton can even have that kind of career for where he got drafted, that's a pretty good deal. He's going to make a lot of money.
Bruce, thank you so much for hopping on this morning. I know it's a busy time of year, but even though the draft itself is done, it doesn't mean that the coverage of it is, and that's why The Athletic is always a great resource. We appreciate your time, sir.
My pleasure. Thanks, guys.
It's Bruce Feldman with us. You can check out his 2025 NFL Draft takeaways on theathletic.com, also at Bruce Feldman on Twitter.